water, earth, fire, air. Long ago, the four nations lived together in harmony.
This week, we're making the map from Avatar the Last Airbender.
So in the past, I made the map from Breath of the Wild, and you guys really seem to like that. So that kicked me off on thinking how much I would love to have a whole heap of display pieces from some of my favorite fantasy maps. So the first one's going to be Avatar, and we're probably gonna have some more in the future. So let me know what you'd like to see me do next. So to start this build, I needed to find some reference images. We obviously have the map from the opening credits, but it didn't have as much detail as I would have liked. So I jumped on Google and found a few really nice recreations of the map. I'm going to be using these two here throughout this entire process. Now that we've picked out our reference images, we're going to need a frame. So I head down to the local thrift shop and find an old painting that I can repurpose its frame. This one will do nicely.
So I take that home, get out the old handy projector, and project our map onto the right size for the frame before grabbing out a piece of foam board. I'm going to be using these thin foam boards as our main structure for the islands, so we line that up and we start tracing around all of our landmasses. I'm using a gold paint pen as it really stands out nicely and reflects that projector back at me, so I find it easy to highlight our islands. Once they're all highlighted, we switch off the projector and we have our basic island's shape. Now, to make sure that we have them lined up properly, we're going to trace everything out again, but this time on the back of the painting. I'll be using a black permanent marker this time as it stands out a lot nicer on the wood. This one doesn't have to be perfect, but it gives us a nice guidance as to where to glue down our islands once we cut them all out. And now we have our frame and our guidance lines ready to go. Now I'm going to pull out some masking tape and tape everything off so as I'm painting everything we don't make a mess of the frame. And now to start cutting. This is by far the longest and most tedious part of this build. I cut out every single one of these islands and it can take a while. Once each piece has been cut out, we'll put down some craft glue, spread it out, and glue that island in place over our guidance marks. There is a lot of cutting in these kinds of builds. There's probably other ways you could go about it with clays or foam clay or something like that, but this is the way I like to do it so that we keep all of our basic landforms at the same height, as this will come in handy later when we pour our resin. And I just keep going around using little scraps for some of the tiny islands, cutting everything out and gluing them in place. I personally think it's much easier to cut out one island and then glue it down, as this helps you keep everything in the right places and not mix them all up. And with the largest landmass of the Earth Kingdom glued down, we're pretty close to having everything in place, with just a few more small islands to get down. And there we have our full base map. Now I'm going to come in with some cheap acrylic blue paint and paint in our oceans. Starting with a big broad brush and then coming in with a smaller brush for all of the details around our islands. And now I'm going to flip over our board and come in with some hot glue around the edges of our frame and backboard. Ultimately, this is going to be useful later on to stop any leakage of resin, but I'm also going to be giving the entire base a coat in a watered down glue mixed with some blue paint. This will dry a lot more transparent, and I'm hoping it's going to help to hold all of these islands in place. So that bit of glue on the back will just stop anything from leaking through, hopefully. And once that has a chance to dry, it comes out nice and transparent with a little bit of a glossy base. Some of that thicker stuff needs a little bit more time to dry, but it's good to go. Now I'm going to grab out this hot tip and melt away all of our rivers. You could cut these in, but I find that this hot tip foam cutter really makes this a lot easier, as I can just run it along all of these areas that I've marked out our rivers, and it will burn away and melt down into our foam, giving us a nice deep groove. And we continue this over our entire map everywhere that our landmasses have a river. Now I don't want the entire landmass to just be flat, So I'm grabbing out some foam clay and I start placing that around all of the land masses, particularly trying to build up areas that I know I want to have cliff faces. By spreading this over most of the board, we get a nice bit of random differentiation, which helps add to that realistic landmass. I'm also using it to add some more gradual curves onto some of our edges for a bit more of a beachy look. I take my time with this, going around every single section that I can and adding in as much variation and detail as I can be bothered with, if I'm being honest. And then we leave that to dry. So the map's starting to come together, but we need mountains. This map has a ton of mountains. So instead of building each one of them individually, what I'm going to do is make up a few basic shapes using some clay, pour a silicone mold, and make a whole ton of them by casting them in resin. So first we're going to need to make our masters. I'm just taking some oven-dried clay and giving some rough mountain shapes before coming in with some different shaping tools and trying to make these as random and realistic as I can. They're obviously not going to be perfect, but by carving in some extra details and flattening out our sides, they definitely start to look a lot more like mountains rather than little bumps of clay. Once I'm fairly happy with the mountains, I built a couple of volcanoes, as we need those for the Fire Nation, and tried to round them off at the base as much as I could to keep it flush with the ground, and then carving in our little crater in the top. Now that I'm pretty happy with my master shapes, I'm going to glue down a cut off paper cup to make a dam around the top and seal it off for our silicone mold. For this, I'm going to be mixing a 2-part silicone rubber. It's a 1-to-1 mix, and then I'm going to start spreading it over all of our mountains. I'm spreading it over them first to try and get into all the details, and then I'm doing a tall pour to try and keep as few bubbles as possible. Once this has had a day to dry, you tear away the paper and cardboard and pull out all of our masters. These are probably trash now, but we are left with a really nice basic mold. I fill this up with some quick dry resin, and pretty quickly we are left with a perfectly recastable set of mountains. And now I can repeat that as many times as I need. So it's taken me a little while, but I've built up a ton of these little mountains out of resin. I've got more than I need, and these will come in handy for future map builds, but for now I can start placing these around the build and gluing them in place. This is much easier than building up all of our mountains individually, and it gives me that reusability that I mentioned. So I just start puzzling them all over the map, trying to follow the original reference image as best as I can. When I'm happy with each placement, I use a little bit of hot glue to hold it in place and just keep on going around the entire map. This map has a lot of mountains, so this was quite a bit of work, but ultimately at this scale, these look brilliant when we're all done. Now that our full land masses are done, I'm going to mix a little bit of matte Mod Podge with a brown paint and seal off all of our land masses. I was a little bit messy with this, so I'm going to come back in with that original blue and clean up all of the coastlines. Now a cheap acrylic white paint is going to be used to coat our northern and southern water tribes with these snowy areas. I'm applying this thick as a little bit of extra texture won't hurt. Making sure to come into all these extended islands and clean up around our coastlines. Then while I've got this white paint out, I start applying some snowy tops to all of the mountain ranges. So I got to this point here and realized that I'd done all the snow, but I didn't like the base color underneath for the mountains. So we're going to repaint over all of them and come back in later on with that snow effect. So I grabbed an Administratum Grey and gave a real heavy coat over all of these rocky mountains. I didn't hit every single mountain range with these, but a large majority of them, particularly the ones in areas that are going to be eventually covered in snow. Once that dried, they got a heavy coat in enolm oil to bring back all of those subtle details and make them look a little bit more rocky. Now, if we look at the map, Ba Sing Se is huge. So I mixed up a little bit of milliput and placed it down around roughly where I believe the borders would be. I then used some tools to try and flatten this out and make it look more like a wall before repeating the process on the interior walls. And there we have our basic wall shape for Ba Sing Se. It's not perfect, but it's going to do for my purposes. I had a little bit of leftover milliput, so I came around some of these areas here and added a few more hills and rough extra pieces of terrain. Once all of that was painted up to match the mountains, the whole build is starting to look pretty damn good. But we still need a lot more work. So I came in with a Ushabti bone over all of the beaches. Once I'd started on this, I decided to go around and add it to a lot more areas over the entire map as I liked the separation of the coastlines. Then grabbing out that white acrylic paint again and coming back in over all of our mountain tops and giving them those snowy peaks. Before coming in and coating our Earth Kingdom and a few other areas of our map in a Armageddon dust from Citadel, and then coming in with a Tamiya brown soil effects over all of our other areas of land to give it a little bit more texture. Once this was dried, I came in with a dry brush of that same Ushabti bone over the deserted areas to help them pop a little bit more and separate them from all of our other Earth Kingdom textures. And then I kind of got distracted and forgot about this build.
Several months later.
Okay, so it's been a few months and I haven't touched the map at all. But the live action Netflix show is coming out next week, so I thought it's really about time I jumped in and finished this build off. So let's grab the map and get back to building.
And the first thing I'm going to do is the rivers. So I grabbed a piece of plastic and some cheap blue acrylic paint and started to paint in all of our rivers. At first I was being really particular about this, then I decided to water it down a little bit and just being messy with the idea that I can come in and fix it up later on. While doing this, I realized that I forgot to add the giant ice wall to the Northern Water Kingdom, so I came in with a bit of milliput similar to what I did for the Ba Sing Se walls and added in a basic wall shape. I also noticed I wanted some more mountains around where the Eastern Air Temple would be, so I grabbed a few of those leftover mountain pieces and blended them all in using milliput. This is why making that mass production of mountains at the start was so handy. I could always just add more as I needed them and I had a big collection to go with. And I can use these again in the future. Now it was time to remove that masking tape, which was actually a bit of a pain. Because I'd left this for so long, it just tore apart and stuck in place. So it took a little bit of extra work, and I peeled a few pieces back along the way. This was easy enough to fix with a little bit of extra paint, but my paints had kind of gone gross. Still worked though. Now in preparation for our resin pour, I came in with a bit of UV resin around all of our edges, dripping it over the very corners and then hitting it with a UV light, hoping to seal this off and dam off any of the corners where more resin might leak. This took a little bit of time and I wasn't super happy with the damming, so ultimately I came back in with another layer of craft glue around all of our edges to attempt to dam up these sides and stop any leakage. You really don't want resin leaking out of the bottom and side of these, as it's a pain in the ass to clean up and it's a waste of a fairly expensive material. So we hit all of our edges with the UV resin and then with the PVA glue and leave that to dry.
Approximately 10 hours later.
Okay, it's the next day and that's all looking pretty good and ready for some resin. But before we mix up our resins, we need to paint over those extra areas that we fixed up before. So we're going to coat them in the same paints, give them the same washes, and blend them all into the original styles. And now she's ready for resin. So we grab out a silicone mixing cup and all of the bits and pieces of clear resin we need. This is a 1-to-1 mix, so I do my best to make sure that we're mixing this in the appropriate quantities, and then I start adding in some alcohol inks. I also added in a little bit of mica powder, as I wanted this water to kind of have a bit of a shine to it and give it something a little bit extra when the light hits it. Ultimately, I think you need to mix a lot more inks in than you think when it's in this tub. When it's this thick, it tends to look a lot darker than once it's spread out over your board, as it's only going to be a couple of mils thick when it's spread into your map. And now that we have that mixed up really nicely, we bring our board back to the table and start pouring out our resin. This stuff is auto leveling, so it should start to spread evenly and fill in most of the gaps. But I did find that it kind of likes to pool, especially when poured at such a thin layer. So I came in and started to spread it all out and fill in all of the gaps between the islands. Once there's a bit of resin there, it allows for more of it to sort of pool and tide. I then mixed up another darker batch of the resin and tried to mix that around the outer areas where I feel like the oceans would be darker. This gives us a little bit more range to the colors and effects of the oceans and water, and ultimately I think just the more variation you can have in a build like this, the nicer it's going to end up looking for the final piece. I also used this to fill in our interior lakes. I then took an eyedropper and started filling in all of the rivers. This takes a lot of patience, and similarly to when I painted the board, I wasn't too worried if I made a bit of mess, because I can always come in later with those same texture paints and cover up any overflow. Once this was put into a lot of the rivers, it also allows for that capillary action to pull a bit more up from the base and level everything out nicely. So I continued around the rest of the board, filling them all in. And once all of our interior waterways are done, we're looking at a pretty nice map. But this needs a night to dry, so I'm gonna throw this in the garage on a nice level surface and let it set. And while that's drying, I decided to print out a few elemental symbols with my 3D resin printer, give them a little bit of a clean up, let them fully cure out in the sun, and then paint them up to match each of the nation's colours. I also tried making some sea monsters out of milliput to match the unagi and the sea serpent that we see through various parts of the show. They came out alright, but they were way too big for the board. So this idea ended up being scrapped, and now I have a couple of leftover random sea serpents for something else in the future.
The following day.
So this has come up looking pretty damn nice. All in all, the resin's dried nicely over the entire thing. It just kind of pulled more in the center and not as much out to the sides as I would have liked. But instead of doing another layer of resin, what I'm going to do is come in with some gloss Mod Podge and put some like ripple effects around the outer edges to put a bit of differentiation in the water and help drive our view to the center. Also, there's a few sections that have completely covered over the smaller islands that I put in, so I'm going to come back in now with a little bit of that texture paste and build them up again on top of the water, as well as cleaning up all of the edges around all of these rivers where I kind of bled over the edge either with the blue paint originally or with the resin. There was also a little bit of a leak underneath. This isn't the end of the world. We're just going to end up with a nice chunk of resin underneath there. Lucky I caught it in time and absolutely coated this with sticky tape to dam everything in. So let's get to the next stage, shall we?
So I grab out that Tamiya soil effects again and start just putting little chunks over all of those islands that had been overtaken with the resin. Honestly, probably would have been fine without it, but I did want that extra little bit of texture poking out on top. Then coming around with a paintbrush and pushing all of these land masses around the rivers right up to the edges and covering up anywhere that we made a little bit of mess with paint or resin. After that, we're going to grab out that gloss Mod Podge and just start plonking it all over the corners of our resin. Now it's time to drop in those elemental symbols that'll corner out our map, hit the entire thing with a jet lighter to pop any of the bubbles that are forming in the glue, and then come in with a straw and start blowing on it to spread these bits of glue out, give them more of a rippled texture. Ultimately, I put this stuff on way too thick, and you're going to see the results of that later on when I ended up removing all of this. But I'm going to show you it anyway in case it's an effect that you like for your build. So we glue each of these symbols in place in their relative corners and then come in with a lot more of that gloss Mod Podge. I ended up pouring it out, which might be another reason it came out way too thick in the end, spreading it as evenly as I can and then coming in and blowing it to get that rippled effect. And we'll give that a night to dry.
Okay, so this has had about almost a full day to dry, and half of these pieces aren't going clear. I think I poured that glue way too thick, and to be honest, I don't actually like the rippled look over the rest of the board anyway. So what I'm going to do is get into here and start peeling this away. This is the best part about this, because if you don't like it, you can very easily remove it. So to each their own, but for me, I'm going to peel this away and try and clean this up in a different way. Oh, that is so satisfying. All right, so we've cleaned all that up. Now it's time to add in our forests. So I'm gonna grab out a heap of different flockings. The main one I'm probably gonna be using are these bigger, thicker ones here, but I want them a little bit thinner. So I'm gonna grab those out and throw them into a coffee grinder.
I'm going to be using two different colors so we get a nice bit of variation in our trees and basically just blast them. Leaving us with some nice thinned out, smaller foliage that has a good mix of colors. Now we go back to our original reference maps, zoom on into each section and start applying glue. I'm just using a cheap PVA glue here. It might dry a little bit glossy, but we're going to cover it up with some matte later on. Once we have it spread out, we just start dropping in our flocking and pressing it down nice and firm. We're going to work our way around all of the areas of forest over the entire board. This is another one of those sections of this build that can be a little bit tedious, but ultimately it makes for a brilliant effect. So I'm constantly going back and forth between my reference images to make sure I put the forests in the correct areas and fill them in with a good amount. Sometimes coming in with some extra flocking. Then once everything is done, coming in with a mix of matte Mod Podge and water and soaking this into all of these bits of flocking. This is going to help hold everything in place and make it nice and solid once it's dried. If you go without this, you might find yourself losing bits of flocking over time when the map is hung on the wall. Right now, that looks weird and white, but we leave that overnight and it dries nice and clear, leaving us with some solid looking forests that are also nice and secure to our board. Now for some final details. We're going to be adding some farmland to the outer walls of Ba Sing Se, and then adding a slightly different brown tone over the walls to help it stand out against the surrounding environment. And now as our final touch, we're going to be adding back in the elemental signs. Since they came off with the glue earlier, we're just going to be super gluing them down this time. I know these aren't the symbols used on the map in the opening credits, but I wanted to use these ones for my build. And that's the fun of building something yourself. You can do whatever you please.
This build came out pretty damn cool in my opinion. There is some little issues around the edges where the resin didn't pull out properly, and some of the ways I attempted to cover that didn't really work how I wanted, but that's all part of the fun of these crafting projects. Sometimes you have to stop and pivot or undo something, but nothing's ever ruined. You can always make do and figure something out. I do think I want to come back in as well and add some lava and some more elements to the volcanoes. Maybe I should add the volcanoes in now. Yeah, let's do it.
So I grabbed the brightest yellow I could find and started dripping it out the top of our volcanoes. I then went around and repeated this over all of the other mountaintops in the Fire Nation. I think I might have done a couple of mountains that didn't need volcanoes, but eh. After the yellow was dry, I came in with an orange, trying to kind of blend bits and pieces but mostly keep them separate, and then coming in with a bright glossy red over the top of all of them. When doing something like lava, you want to start with the brightest color and work your way up to the darkest, the opposite to most painting techniques.
And there we have it, a finished map from Avatar the Last Airbender. And I am stoked with how this has come out.
I personally love the end result for this build. Working at this scale for maps was a lot of fun. The mountains look awesome. The forests have come out with a really natural look. And overall, I'm just loving this map. Scale is a little bit difficult for things like cities and other stuff I would love to get included on the map. But overall, it really works for things like the mountain ranges and the forests and some of these bigger elements to the world. And it's a map. A lot of maps don't have every single city in detail, so this is more than good enough for what my design needs to be.
But I do want to do a follow-up at some point where I add in a lot more details, like a few more of the cities, like a Mars chute, the Northern Water Kingdom, and a few of our air temples. If there's any other little details you'd like to see me add if I do a follow-up, please let me know in the comments below and I'll add them to the list. I hope you guys have enjoyed this one, and I'd love to see what you guys can do if you have a go at building something like this yourself. Until next time, never stop making stuff.
And check out this video here for my first attempt at making a map.